Hi, my name is Timothy Chong, and today I'll be presenting on Assignment 2A, International Trade and Foreign Exchange. Question 1, the recent trade retaliation between Australia and China. So without further ado, let's get into it. So here is a brief historical summary of the Australia-China trade relations. In 1973, Gough Whitlam became the first Australian Prime Minister to visit China. Later established the foundation for the present-day bilateral relationship during that same year between the two nations. Since the 70s, China's economic growth entailed urbanization, investment in infrastructure, and growth in manufacturing, which led to growing demand for resources, in which Australia was able to cater to China's demands and was a ready market for Chinese manufactured goods. So this visit to China would prove to be a milestone between the two countries' trade relationships and subsequent years. So here is the Australia during the global financial crisis and the high point of the Australia-China trade relations. So we start off with the global financial crisis. In 2008, Australia's strong economic performance helped avoid the GFC recession and is only one of four developed countries to avoid recession, along with South Korea, Israel, and Poland. Australia also did not record a recession for 29 years since the 1990s, and this can be partly accredited to China's robust demand of resources, which also include energy and raw materials for manufacturing. And now, the high point came in 2014 when China sealed a major trade agreement called the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, which highlights five key points, which includes Australia exporters get wider access to lucrative Chinese markets. Secondly, there will be an 85% Australian exports being eliminated in China, which includes beef and dairy. Number three, there will be tariff-free Chinese exports to Australia. Number four, the threshold was raised from 248 to 1 billion Australian dollars for Chinese investment and without a government review. Number five would be that service sectors get freer access in both countries in terms of tourism, healthcare, and insurance and banking. So here is the China and Australia trade relations in 2018 and to 2019. So as you can see from the pie chart on the left, you see that China uh, is observed that China represents Australia's largest trading partner, having slightly more than a quarter of the market share compared to the rest of the countries. So this is to give an idea of how important China is to the Australian economy. And here we have the balance of payments for Australia over the last 30 years. We can see that Australia had been experiencing a current account surplus based on the BOP, indicating that there are more exports than imports of goods and services. And this figure was this account surplus was achieved in the last 2 years or so. Before that, it was running at a deficit. And the bar chart below shows the Australia's imports from and exports to China. This chart, we can see that imports and exports have increased over the last 19 or 20 years or so, and that Australia and this chart also proves that the trade surplus that Australia has with China that exports were more than imports dating back to at least 2010. According to Argus Media, Australia's reported a record trade surplus with China, driven by high demand for iron ore export receipts. So these are the current state of affairs of the Australia-China trade relations, three damaging episodes. So the first issue came with Huawei, and this is also arguably one of the most scarring issues that happened between the two nations, which was when Australia decided to exclude the Chinese company Huawei from supplying technology for their 5G networks as a means of taking the lead role in lobbying its Five Eyes partners. For little context, the Five Eyes partners include five English-speaking democracies, which includes the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. So not only did Australia try to exclude Huawei, but it also lobbied for other countries to follow suit, which did not sit well with Beijing. The second issue came in late 2019 when Prime Minister Scott Morrison volunteered and took lead for an investigation into China's responsibility for the coronavirus which emerged in the city of Wuhan, with no prior diplomatic consultation with Beijing. So this again angered Beijing in some ways. And the third issue came, uh, which was the prevention of the Hong Kong listed China Mengniu Dairy from the $600 million acquisition of the Japanese owned Lion Dairy and Drinks from Treasury Josh Frydenberg further damaged the relationship between Australia and China. This decision was believed to be politically motivated, and it was to satisfy critics of the sale of Australian assets to Chinese entities. Um, this all happened back in around the last 2 years or so. So here are the other issues that angered China. Australia was also vocal and expressed criticisms of China's treatment of the Uyghurs during countries at the UN Human Rights Council, which includes Germany, UK, and Canada, in urging upon China to end its detention of the ethnic minority. Secondly, Australia also took a critical stance on China's recent security law in Hong Kong, which resulted in the suspension of extradition treaty with Hong Kong. Australia also extended visas for residents of Hong Kong by 5 years and encouraged businesses there to relocate. So this is China's response to Australia's actions. And in 2021, China indefinitely suspended key economic dialogue with Australia and also accused Australia of having a Cold War mindset. So let's take a look at what China has done to Australia. So back in May 2020, China confirmed an imposition of anti-dumping duty on Australian barley exports of more than 80% following an 18-month investigation. Before this, Australia was able to export barley tariff-free through the free trade agreement, but that is not the case for now. Second of all, the beef exports from 4 Australian abattoirs were also banned by Chinese authorities due to mislabeling and certification issues. And China's action here is justified because the abattoirs had a long history of errors, but however, China only decided to pick on this issue only as recent as 2020. Third, also came during June, China warned its citizens against visiting and pursuing studies in Australia, citing rising discrimination and racism against Chinese and Asian ethnicities. This would impact the Australian tourism and education industry because a lot of Chinese students and tourists goes to China for these reasons. So this is the continued threat for China's response to Australia's actions. The Australian wine was also targeted by Beijing because Beijing claimed that it was being quote unquote dumped at an unfair price. The formalized temporary anti-dumping duties imposed on cheap Australian wine by China, in which the duties range between 116 to 218%, left Australian wine unviable for the Chinese consumers and was no longer competitive in the Chinese market. The other issue is that China stopped purchasing coal from Australia in late of 2020 and as a result faced its worst power crisis in years due to a shortage. However, analysts predict that China would tap on other international suppliers or boost its own coal production and push its industries to curb output and emissions uh, and to not buy Australian coal as much as possible. So this is how Australia responded back. So in December 2020, Australia filed a complaint towards the World Trade Organization. Australia claimed that China deviated 26 times from WTO rules during its anti-dumping investigation, and that they used third-party sales to justify the dumping. Australia also requested the WTO to establish a dispute settlement panel to investigate tariffs over Beijing's anti-dumping duties. in which WTO had agreed with Australia's request to establish a dispute settlement panel, but the story is still developing at the time of my recording, so uh, we still do not know what happens next. So here are the impacted industries and countries. Based on the chart that you see here, this is the yearly value of Australian goods and services exports, with travel, coal, and education being the top three sectors uh, that are being targeted by China's trade actions. Moreover, we see that the Australian beef industry, which is worth a yearly 2.6 billion Australian dollars, and China was also Australia's largest market with 24% of all Australian beef exported to China in 2019. In 2020, China became the third largest, which was a decline of 35%. The Australian wine industry, worth 6 billion Australian dollars yearly, also in the first quarter of 2021, Australia was no longer the top wine exporter to China. And we can see that between December 2020 and March 2021, the wine exports plunged from 325 million Australian dollars to only 12 million Australian dollars from Australia to China. Other countries also took opportunities to fill the Australian sheep gap, because in between January to April 2021, the US had sold 48,000 ship weight beef to China, which was a sharp increase from only 3,000 ship weight in the same period of 2020. We also see that other countries such as Argentina and Brazil also increased exports to China for beef, with Brazilian beef exports increasing as much as 76% in 2020 and accounting for 43% of China's beef imports. So this is the continued threat for the impacted industries and countries. We see that the Australia's exports to China between the years 2019 to 2020 dropped by 2.3 billion, which is not a very sharp drop considering all the tariffs and duties, but this is the economic cost that Australia has to pay for meddling in China's affairs and issues. And the only saving grace comes from China's reliance on Australian iron ore, which may not last long. Ultimately, the importers and consumers in China and Australia will bear the cost and from the trade war and suffer as a consequence. So this is a recommended course of action for the government and other policymakers. So Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull, the both former prime ministers, agreed that Australia should talk less in order to improve bilateral relationship with China, because whatever that Australia has been trying to do, enforcing its political stance, has failed. Australia should now focus on fostering a sensible long-term foreign policy by working with China alongside like-minded countries in multilateral forums such as APEC, ASEAN, and G20. Australia should also update and lobby to reform the WTO on trading rules to wrap China up in strong up-to-date rules and reduce tensions between the two nations, and to make China a more rule-based player and not act on its own accord. Lastly, Australia and China should identify practical issues that can be addressed together and look for mutually beneficial solutions for both countries. This can be climate change, which both countries may see eye to eye. And with that, I conclude my presentation. And Australia and China should try to find a way to fix things out and try to look at this at a more economic perspective, and that the two countries need each other to survive. So this is my reference list, and this is part 2 of my reference list. Okay, thank you.